So we know that you don't let diabetes hold you back. When you said you wanted testing to be easier, we heard you. And when you said you wanted a meter that keeps up with your active lifestyle, we heard that too. That's why we've gone to great lengths to provide a simple testing experience. Discover the upside of the spill-resistant Smart Pack, designed to hold its test strips in place, even upside down. Easily remove one single test strip at a time. Plus, the unique test strips with the widest dosing area on the market makes testing even easier. And by connecting to the MySugar app, you can log your data automatically. Call now or visit Accucheck.ca to get a free Accucheck guide meter. Plus, receive bonus access to MySugar Pro. Discover the Simply Smart Accucheck guide system to ease your diabetes management. Okay, I'm ready to come down now. Hello?
What if the Van Hoop Master Roaster mastered the Charleston instead of coffee? He'd still be a master, but we'd miss his rich, flavorful coffee.
Are we ever gonna get to meet with an advisor?
Can't think of a day that works.
Hi, I'm Julia from CRDC.
Oh, hi.
We help you put the big stuff first with advice that can come to you. We haven't come this far by accident. We haven't left this to luck. We're here because we are willing to work for it. From the farms to the forests, from our mountains to our coastlines, from our most remote communities to our busiest of cities. It's the Canadian dream, and we'll get out of it what we put into it. Introducing 8 all-new 2019 Chevrolet Silverados, because there's work to be done.
You're watching CTV News Channel. I'm Todd Vanderheyden, and good to have you with us on this Wednesday afternoon. A disturbing report, the first of its kind here in Canada, finding that women or girls in our country killed once every 2.5 days. The first annual report from the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability shows that in 2018, 148 women and girls were killed in Canada. 90% of those accused were men. Breaking down the numbers even further as we dig deeper, the report says 21% of the victims were killed by a stranger, 53% by an intimate partner, 13% by another male family member. The report's lead author says the facts underscore how the circumstances and motivations surrounding women's violent deaths differ from those of men. And that's why there is a need for different types of prevention. For more, let's go to Ottawa and bring in women's rights advocate and public educator Julie Lalonde, who is standing by in the Capitol. Julie, good to have you with us. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Were you surprised by these numbers or not really?
Unfortunately, I wasn't surprised. I've been following the work that the observatory's been doing, but I think laying it out so clearly in black and white, every 2.5 days, a woman or girl was killed last year, the youngest victim being 3 weeks old. I think we have a crisis on our hands, and what's frustrating to me is that we're not talking about it at the level that we should be.
Those numbers are very stark, and they certainly are red flags. Let me ask you about the issue of violence, particularly when it is done by somebody that the woman or the girl might in fact know, and as we pointed out in the beginning, mostly by men.
Yeah, 90% of the people who stand accused in those murders are men. And that's what's different between violence against women and violence against men, is that largely men are killed by other men. And overwhelmingly, that's the case. Whereas women, you are more likely to be killed by a man, and you are more likely to be killed by a man that you know. And so we have to differentiate between those two things when we talk about this issue. And we have to talk about the fact that so many women are killed by current or former partners. And so when we live in a culture in which we tell women, you know, if he's awful to you, just leave him, well, that's actually the time in which women's lives are most at risk. And so what are we doing to show women safe places to go to? What are we doing to fund women's shelters, women's support services? And, you know, what are we doing to talk to young men? Because this report comes out, you know, the same week that people are exploding with rage about this one ad that Gillette created about masculinity. But it's clearly important that we talk about the role of men.
And we saw the hashtag people are using on social media, call it femicide. Even that word itself, Julie, I just want to get your read on that. people might not even be aware when we say femicide, what exactly that means. They're not familiar with it. It's not used like the way we use homicide, for example, but so important to sort of begin to have that conversation, almost like a rethink, really, in the way we view things.
Absolutely. You can't change something that you don't name. And just like how we spent years trying to get people to name sexual harassment in the workplace or sexual assault, we have to name femicide for what it is. And I do understand that for Canadians to hear that 148 cases of femicide happened here in Canada, that's shocking. And I want to create space for people to sort of sit with that, because it's like, whoa, femicide in Canada? But yeah, femicide in Canada. And the statistics get even more stark when you look at how, Indigenous women represent 5% of the Canadian population, but they're 36% of the women who were killed last year. Indigenous women, rural women make up 16% of the Canadian population, but they make up 34% of the women who were killed last year. So we really got to look at this and sort of dig deep into who's the most at risk.
In terms of those most at risk, you talked about Indigenous women, you talked about women who may be isolated or living in parts of rural Canada where they simply don't have access to resources, or perhaps, Julie, they simply don't know who to actually call or reach out to. Do you think that's going on?
Absolutely. There was a case in 2014 where 3 women were murdered in Wilno, which is a small community outside of Ottawa, and one of the women had a police-issued panic button, but she lived 40 minutes away from the closest OPP detachment. So what do you do in a case like that? The police clearly see that this woman's life is at risk, but what do you do when you live so far from other places? And I don't think forcing women to move to urban areas is an appropriate response, but we clearly need to do something to address the high rates of violence for women who are particularly geographically isolated.
Such an important conversation, Julie. Thank you for taking the time to come on the program today with us.
Thanks so much.
Julie Lalonde, women's rights activist, talking about this new report on femicide in Canada. In a moment for us, a by-election in British Columbia that could change the balance of power in the province. There is a riding on Vancouver Island, and Nanaimo voters are going to the polls today, and the significance is pretty big. We'll be right back.
You're watching CTV News Channel.
From day one, you push your body, both physically and mentally. You push the limits. You push past the pain. You push and push. That's what it means to live a full life. And while your bladder may be a little weaker, the rest of you sure isn't. For all the living you have yet to do, you've got protection a period pad can't provide. You got poise.
Tired of paying too much for internet, TV, and home phone? Are bills impacting your budget? Call Comwave and join the wave. With the Comwave Power Bundle, you get a home phone line, unlimited high-speed internet, and TV with all your favorite channels, all for only $89.95 a month. Call now and get 6 months absolutely free. Be like hundreds of thousands of Canadians and join the wave.
So let me get this straight. I get a home phone line,
Unlimited internet, so no more overage charges.
TV with over 75 channels, all for only $89.95 a month. Get unlimited internet and TV with all your favorite channels for only $89.95 a month. Call now and get 6 months free. That's right, your home phone, unlimited internet, and TV, all for 6 months absolutely free.
Now that's a great deal.
Stop paying too much. Call 1-866-292-7807 and join the wave.
They say CPAs are boring. Changing music's business model? Yeah, that's boring. Starting your own brand? Snore. Fighting cybercrime? How about making movies happen? Launching the next big wow. Influencing laws. Bored yet? Then there's AI, saving the environment, rethinking tomorrow's currency. CPAs are reshaping every landscape we live in and work in. So if that's boring, then call us boring.
Welcome back to CTV News Channel. Big day in politics in British Columbia, all because of a provincial by-election that's going on in Nanaimo on the island.
Let's go green!
Let's go green. That's what this candidate is hoping voters will do. She and her supporters were out early this morning. Today's by-election is important for the following reason. British Columbia's legislature is potentially up for grabs. If the Liberals were to win this by-election, they would have 43 seats, and that would tie them with the 43 seats currently held by the NDP and the Greens, which are in a coalition of sorts under Premier John Horgan. The Greens did agree to support the NDP after the provincial election in 2017, allowing them to form minority government, so the Liberals are hoping they can shift the balance of power potentially. David Ball is joining us. He is a journalist with the Star of Vancouver, covering this story, no doubt, up close and personal. So it's really interesting. We don't normally talk about provincial by-elections, of course, certainly not the scrutiny here, but because BC politics are always very fascinating, and here we go again. Another great example, David.
Fascinating is one word for what we have here. I call it the Wild West. We've got two reporters on the ground in Nanaimo right now, Jesse Winter and Mel Green from the Star, and they're talking to people. It seems like locals don't really seem to care about what the provincial legislature does, but everyone else is watching this saying, holy cow, we could have the whole thing topple. It's like a house of cards here. Now, one thing to note, 43 to 43, if the BC Liberals win this, and the NDP Greens stay in coalition, but that means the Speaker is the tie-breaking vote, and he used to be a BC Liberal who crossed the floor or was kicked out of his party for becoming a Speaker and saving the NDP's hide 2 years ago.
Yeah, right. Even more sort of complicating factors here. We're just going to show our viewers, as we're talking, David, what we're talking about in terms of the stakes here for folks coast to coast. Basically, the Liberals now have 42 seats. The NDP and the Greens have got 43. There's one independent, as you mentioned, Speaker, and there is a vacant seat as well, and that's the one in Nanaimo everyone's focused on. So obviously, in terms of a political story, it would be very interesting if the Liberals were to win. But we want to be careful here because, correct me if I'm wrong, Nanaimo is real NDP stronghold territory.
Yes, it has only been won by the Liberals once since 1972. That was in 2001 when the NDP was in government and was embroiled in a whole bunch of spending scandals and corruption. So, 2001, the whole province turned against the NDP en masse, except for 2 seats. I doubt that's going to happen now. The Liberals were hoping that this independent speaker's investigation into some spending scandals would have potentially brought him down as well as the seat and given them an advantage, but to many people that are being talked to on the ground, he's a bit of a folk hero right now for going against the culture of entitlement. So that's not going to be in play here. But what is in play is that there's a speculation tax on housing for people who have second units that are occupied, and that's causing a lot of concern in Nanaimo from homeowners concerned that they're being unfairly targeted by a tax that forces you to opt out instead of just finding out who should pay it.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there are also obviously, at least 2 elections going on here. There's, the sort of the national interest in this and province-wide interest because the balance of power potentially at stake. But for folks living in Nanaimo, it is bread and butter issues and local issues as you're talking about. Are you getting any sense, David, in terms of the turnout? Are we seeing more people turning out than in previous elections?
The advanced turnout has been higher all the way along from previous elections and definitely any previous by-election. As you mentioned, does anyone really care about by-elections other than the parties? I mean, they're a bit of a yawner. As a political reporter, I feel that there's a by-election. Oh no, here we go again. Can't we just have a 4-year break between our election coverage? This one is way different than one I've ever covered, and it's got that excitement because it not only brings the legislature into play. That's going to keep being an issue as long as the NDP has less seats than the Liberals and has to work with the Greens. What I think it shows is the way our constitutional system works, and kind of how parties don't just get elected on a majority of popular votes. They get elected and they have to form together to gain support for their legislation and their agenda in the House. And then sometimes that means working in coalitions. And calculations like this by-election has clearly revealed.
David Ball with the Star of Vancouver. We love having you on the program, David, as always. And thank you for taking a bit of time for us today. We appreciate it. All right, again, that by-election going on in the riding of Nanaimo on Vancouver Island. As the results come in tonight, we'll bring you them right here on CTV News Channel, and of course the implications tomorrow. This is another interesting story now as well that we wanted to get on the show. A man from the United Kingdom who caused a scene on board a WestJet flight that was flying from Calgary to London, has been fined $21,000 because of his actions that forced the plane to turn back. 44-year-old David Young, his name, described as being drunk and belligerent on board the flight.